We're here to discuss the latest developments in India, and I am certainly struck after 4 years of reporting from India on the scale of the Modi election victory and what I experienced and we've all experienced with the campaign, evidence of a changing society in India, and the emphatic result which we saw in May. And we've got a panel of speakers here to discuss what that means, how to interpret it, and the most important points that come from it. Our speakers, not in this order, will be Richard Heald from the UK India Business Council and Gareth Price from Chatham House. But I'm guessing that a fair number of people in this room are particularly keen to hear from Manoj Ladwa, who is the Communications Director for Narendra Modi in the campaign and has close ties to him in the post-campaign period as well.
I'd like to start off highlighting a particular event that's happened over the last couple of days, and that's, as many of you know, the BRICS countries, the leaders of the BRICS countries have been meeting in Brazil for a summit. And in India, there was some chatter over the last couple of weeks as to whether or not Mr. Modi should attend the BRICS summit. There was some criticism that the BRICS countries are, in actual fact, being steered by, and it's a China-led initiative, and it's losing traction. You may have heard that an announcement was made earlier on today that the BRICS countries are coming together and setting up a new development bank. And this had been a point of discussion over the last 2 or 3 years. But it was, by all reports, Mr. Modi that pushed for equal shareholding of this bank. There was a lot of resistance from the Chinese in relation to this. And secondly, that India would take the leadership of this new bank for the first 6 years, that to be located in Beijing. The reason I say this is that it starts to demonstrate an intent that has not been seen about India for quite some time now, to lead, to take decisive positions on the world stage. And during the election campaign, though it was principally a domestic campaign, as you'd have expected, there were a couple of points within the campaign that had international strategic significance. One was a speech that Mr. Modi made in one of the northeastern states of India, where he talked about the Chinese expansion and warning China against its expansionist desires on India. Coincidentally, it was 24 hours after Obama had made a similar statement whilst he was meeting the Dalai Lama. And the second, and I felt the most telling remark that Mr. Modi made during the election campaign on international affairs, where he said that in a rally in the state of Haryana, that India and Pakistan have a battle. But that battle is not against each other. That's a battle together to fight poverty. Hindu fundamentalist, nationalist leader making a statement like that. He repeated it in the context of Hindu and Muslim communities in Patna in a rally, where he said the battle between Hindus and Muslims was the battle against poverty, not against each other. Setting the tone for what I believe is how he was seeing himself leading India. And you also then saw his invitation unexpectedly to the world of Nawaz Sharif and the SAARC leaders as well. So I'm just giving an overview of some of the international affairs issues, given that we are at Chatham House, to give indications of the intent with which Mr. Modi is working the international stage, and things will hopefully transpire. I mentioned rallies, and to bring it back to the campaign, and I'm sure some of you would be interested in the campaign and the statistics, and I'm sure there'll be lots of books about it in the future. But Mr. Modi, over a period of 45 days, addressed over 195 rallies, live rallies, more than 4 rallies per day, every day in 2 different regions. He did not miss one single of these rallies. Now, the significance of that was that there were crowds of 50,000, 100,000, a few places, 200, 250,000. Never in the history of India had we seen so many crowds consistently coming out, north, south, east, and west of India. Nehru did it to some extent, but at a time when there wasn't television. Vajpayee was able to do it, but he did not cross the Vindhyas. Here you had a leader who was able to connect to each and every part of the country in with such momentum that during the election campaign, we did start to sense that there was a wave towards the BJP, and you'll question me maybe later on that. Over 3,000 rallies, virtual rallies through 3D and through the tea stall discussions as well across the area. Never had India seen such an engagement between a politician and the public. So something I just wanted to flag that particular point. The use of technology during the campaign as well. Narendra Modi said that this use of technology is not there to show off. The use of technology is to demonstrate to young Indians that India can use the very best technology for various different purposes for good. And so 3D was about demonstrating to young Indians that India can be at the very top when it comes to using technology. And technology is one of the big themes that there's a lot of discussion on social media about the Modi campaign and social media. For me, one of the most significant aspects of it was the use of social media to crowdsource ideas. We had over 100,000 different posts on the website, different comments about what should or should not go in the BJP manifesto. That could have been one of the reasons why it was delayed, why it took so long to get out. In relation to Mr. Modi's speeches throughout the campaign, there was a lot of talk over many months that it would be a Hindutva-led campaign, very divisive campaign. Throughout the campaign, what I think you'd have noticed is that, and our research showed this, is the topics that had the most resonance with the electorate were jobs, 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 whether it was in the northeast or whether it was in Kerala. And the entire campaign, as you saw Mr. Modi moving to the center ground. If you look at British politics or any politics around the world, political leaders that win elections tend to be able to come into the center ground, and I saw a lot of that during the election campaign. Was the mandate a surprise? For us within the campaign, towards the end of the campaign, as we started to see the momentum, towards the end of the last 2 phases in particular, we were expecting to win big. We were expecting probably to cross over the 272 mark. But to give you an insight, over a year and a half ago, when the whole concept of Mission 272 came up, and the BJP endorsed that as its main campaign objective, Mr. Modi, in an internal meeting, did one simple thing. He put a plus in front of the 272. It was a very clear objective of the BJP to try and win a mandate on its own throughout that.
I think clearly I'd agree with what Manoj has said. I think that the scale of the victory was something of a surprise. I personally expected a very significant showing by the BJP and the NDA, and possibly that the NDA would get an absolute majority. But the result actually came as a real bolt from the blue. And I think key things that have struck me in the 49 or 50-odd days that we've had since the election is first that the BJP achieved an absolute majority of 282 seats, and yet they still honoured the pledges and the agreements of the NDA coalition, and therefore, to a large extent, this consensus building within the NDA has been honoured and has held firm. The second is that there's been something of a revolution that has taken place within Delhi since the NDA government has come to power. And that was one of the most significant things in my mind, is the meeting that Modi held in his office with all the head civil servants of all the ministries, in which he basically empowered them to take decisions. He removed the threat of the CBI off their back, which was a major dead hand in terms of making decisions, and said, if you have problems, then come straight to me, come to the PMO. And I think that obviously we've got to see how that filters through and percolates through into the decision-making process. But one of the things that we have suffered from under UPA2 particularly has been an inability to take decisions. So here we have a government which is empowering people to take decisions. I think if I can just address the budget which came out last week. I was actually in Bangalore and I watched some of it on television. I have to say the headline that appeared in one of the magazines over the weekend was From Hype to Reality. And I think that it was a disappointment at a superficial level. And I'll explain that, because what we've seen both in the manifesto, the election, and in the 49 days running up to the budget has been an absolutely remarkable choreography of a rollout of power and a change. And yet what we saw in the budget was rather a kind of retrospective type catalogue of minor announcements. But within the 2.5 hours that Mr. Jaitley was on his feet, minus 5 minutes from when he sat down, but he came out with some quite significant and positive statements. We had statements in relation to the economic, statements in relation to fiscal discipline, which I think is absolutely fundamental. We had statements with regard to reform of tax, although clearly we didn't have the statements in relation to retrospective tax reform that we would have liked. But there is clarity now in terms of going forward. There was a process. We had statements in relation to FDI in certain key areas, defense and insurance. These were things that we were looking for. We have to look at what the detail actually says. But what you've seen is a clear direction of travel being mapped out. I think there are two things that one has to realize and put into context in relation to the statements that we've had. Is the first, that unlike our system, Indian politicians, Indian cabinet ministers do not shadow their portfolios. So ministers are coming in and they're having to go from the ground up and learn on the job as it is, as it were, in relation to their portfolios. And therefore, I think that what you are seeing is an interim measure, an interim statement. But I think the importance that we should take of it is the direction in which we're going. The other thing that I think one has to look at about the budget is that this government is going to be in power for, unless a major disaster occurs, for at least 2 terms. And that, I think, is very much at the back of Prime Minister Modi's mind and at the back of his cabinet as well, that actually this is a gradual, there are some very significant structural things that have to be changed. They can't do them immediately. It's going to take time. This revolution, in my mind, will take time for 10 years. So I think that the start of this administration has been extremely good.
I think one of the issues for India until this election I mean, this was the first election for 30 years that's returned a majority government, just to reiterate the point. So for 25 years, India has had coalitions, and coalitions mean that there are junior partners need ministries to control, and you look at the effects of that in nearly every sphere in India. So one of the issues, if you look at the issue of power, for instance, there were 7 ministries working on the issue of power. So one of the big challenges for India for 25 years has been to develop a coherent policy towards one of the fundamental issues in India. And instead you have competing ministries working in competing directions, often trying to raise money for their parties. There's another question which Richard alluded to, which is another problem in India, is implementation. That's the challenge that's going to take longer to resolve. But in the first instance, to be in a position to put together coherent policies, this is something new, and it hasn't happened for a quarter of a century. And within that quarter of a century, India has actually been transformed anyway, economically. I mean, I think in terms of foreign policy, there are going to be 3 key issues. And the first that's come out very clearly is the desire for regional stability and taking greater advantage of regional economic opportunities. And again, even here, the point about the coalitions comes into this, that one of the big issues in the previous government's foreign policy is it had an agreement with Bangladesh over a water sharing agreement. And it was scuppered by the government of West Bengal. Now that play between regional parties, because the central government is weak, again, this has now been removed, and this gives scope, both in domestic policy making and in foreign policy making, for sensible decisions that most people would have done at any point over the past 25 years, but they didn't do it because they were reliant on coalitions. So I think that's important. I think there is another issue in terms of the region, though, that's maybe more of a challenge. And I was in Pakistan in April, and I said, what do you think would happen if Narendra Modi came to power? And they said, well, he'll be domestically focused, and he won't start looking in the region for a couple of years. And again, the point that he's got a majority meant that one of the first things he could do was to invite the leaders of all the countries of SAARC, as well as the Tibetan Prime Minister in exile, to come along. And it took Pakistan quite a while to respond, because it was a surprise. We recently released a report about water, and one of the issues that came up in Nepal and Bangladesh is how do we respond if India were to come to us with an offer? And I think there's a danger on the regional side that Narendra Modi might put forward positive solutions, but it'll actually be the smaller neighbours that will find themselves not in a position to respond. So I think regional stability is going to be a key part of foreign policy. The second is looking for foreign investment. You know, it's going to be an economically focused foreign policy, and clearly the first places he's going to look for that are East Asia, including China. And he's already signed agreements for China to open up, or an MOU for China to open up 4 industrial parks, despite the security concerns, with Korea, and in particular, I'd say, with Japan. Shinzo Abe's Twitter feed, and I presume it is the genuine one, Shinzo Abe, Japan's Prime Minister, follows 3 people, one of whom is his wife, one of whom is a former governor of Tokyo, and the other is Narendra Modi. So expect a lot of Japanese investment. It'll be very interesting, the relationship with the West, and the extent to which the visa ban issue following the Gujarat riots in 2002 plays on his mind. I think it's fair to say that there's certainly a number of northern European countries that will not be his top priority. But I think the final thing that's a continuing issue in Indian foreign policy is the crisis management side of it. It's what happens if there's a terrorist attack linked to Pakistan-based militants. After very strong rhetoric during the election campaign, how would he respond? What happens if Chinese soldiers cross the line of control into India? And there are crises ongoing now. India's consulate in Herat was attacked a couple of weeks ago. And when I was in India a couple of weeks ago, the nurses in Iraq and some Punjabi labourers are still being held by ISIS in Iraq. And those kind of immediate crisis management things could well derail both the domestic and certainly the foreign policy.